Or yes, this Honorable Superior Court for the County of Wake is now convened and sitting for a special proceeding. The Honorable Judge Brian Collins Jr., President presiding. Or yes, God save the state and this Honorable Court. Please be seated. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, council. Good afternoon, Madam Clerk. Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Deputy Donovan. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this special ceremonial session of the Wake County Superior Court. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to preside over this celebration of the lives and careers of our honorees. To the families and the loved ones of our honorees, thank you for being here. We are honored by your presence. This time I want to turn the ceremony over to the President of the Wake County Bar Association and the 10th Judicial District Bar, Ashley Campbell.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Campbell. I am President of the 10th Judicial District, and on behalf of the more than 5,600 lawyers in our county, I am so pleased to welcome you today and to have all of you here as we celebrate the lives of our friends and colleagues, Mr. Casey, Mr. Jordan, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Purrington. We have a wonderful group of speakers who are going to tell you about each of these gentlemen. And I'd like to take a special moment to thank the Memorials Committee that puts together this program, does great work for us, and introduce its chair, Andrew Chalk.
Madam President, Your Honor, members of the bar, members of the committee, and most importantly, all of you, thank you for joining us today and allowing us to honor your loved ones. We gather at these memorial sessions of court not to mourn anyone, but to celebrate the lives of 4 members of our bar, in this case, 4 giants of our profession. And without fail, we always learn something new about each honoree that we did not know before, and we're always reminded of the many wonderful things about each of them. I'll remind our speakers, as our videographer has reminded me, to come up and speak at the microphone because it's not only being amplified for the audience so everyone can hear, but also for the video, which each family is entitled to a copy of. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Charles Caldwell. He is the Chief Public Defender at the Wake County Public Defender's Office here in Raleigh, and he's going to talk to us about Willis Robert Casey, Jr.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hello. I'm Charles Caldwell, here to speak on behalf of Willis Robert Casey, Jr. I'd like to welcome here today also Robert's brother and sister, Walker and Susan, who are sitting up here in the front row to your left. I suppose many of you were somewhat familiar with Robert, and hopefully that will put into context what I have to say. Trying to find details of Robert is akin to looking for Citizen Kane's rosebud. He did not speak of his personal life, and he did not share outside of a very small circle. However, according to sources, Robert was a perfect gentleman, an excellent person, a very good trial attorney, politically conservative, and held an abiding and strong Christian faith. As said, Robert was a very good attorney. He put aside his personal opinions when representing a client and zealously pursued the facts, the law, and the Constitution. When not at the office, Robert could be found at the YMCA on Hillsborough Street, where he would stay until after closing. The Y and its fellowship were his family. Robert's opinion of governmental largesse was summed up by a pat on the back, right here, as a parody of the welfare recipient's declaration It's not tax money, it's government money. A confirmed bachelor, Robert had his own interpretation of the Billy Graham rule, which has to do with married men being in private or solo situations with women, such as don't go to a meeting where you're the only man with only one woman, don't have dinner with a woman who is not your wife, and it avoids a lot of speculation, a lot of problems. I don't think Robert really ever worried about being accused of anything. He just stuck along with his 50-foot rule. Another rule Robert would follow about women, but he would never be the only male in an elevator with women. The only exception to that, I believe, was Rose Damon, who y'all might remember as C.K. Brown's secretary. They were both in the same building for years. And it was likely Robert just forgot, because Rose was probably talking so much he just forgot what else was going on. Robert was one of the most socially conservative individuals any of us have ever known. What this liberal Democrat found delightful, though, about Robert was that he would not pontificate his positions, as he did not expect you to agree with him. His conservative social beliefs made logical and practical sense, both in a personal and a broad way. Yet he realized that broad policy can be debated with no resolution. So, when Robert was ready to step out of the conversation, he would turn his head down, reach into his shirt pocket, draw out and read silently scriptures on a well-worn card he kept in his pocket. With the scriptures, Robert always agreed. Thank you. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Nell Joslin, daughter of former president of our bar, Bill Joslin. She's a graduate of Stetson Law School and a friend of John Jordan.
Good afternoon, and today here is Brenda Jordan, John's widow. John Richard Jordan Jr. had an illustrious career as a lawyer in Raleigh for more than 50 years. He was influential in and left his mark on the fields of banking, politics, higher education, and historical preservation. John was born in Winton, North Carolina, in Hertford County in 1921 and received both his undergraduate and law degrees from Chapel Hill. In 1952, he started his own law practice in a one-room office on Fayetteville Street in Raleigh. This modest beginning marked the founding of the law firm now known as Jordan, Price, Wall, Gray, Jones, and Carlton. Early on, John was active in politics. In 1956, he served as president of the North Carolina Young Democrats, the year that Adlai Stevenson was nominated for the second time to run against Dwight Eisenhower. And John was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention that year. John served in the North Carolina Senate in the 50s and 60s, where he championed the cause of higher education. In 1964, John ran for North Carolina lieutenant governor, and he lost in the Democratic primary to Bob Scott, who of course later went on to win that race and then became governor 4 years later. You may recall that the Democratic primary in 1964 was hotly contested, with a very close governor's race and runoff between Richardson Pryor, I. Beverly Lake, and Dan K. Moore. However, John Jordan and Bob Scott remained collegial, and there were apparently no hard feelings, because 4 years later, Scott, then governor, appointed John Jordan as chairman of the North Carolina State Board of Social Services, during which time John led the way in streamlining state welfare procedures which had been in great disarray. Through the early 70s, John's firm grew and developed a specialty in representing commercial banks and banking organizations. John became the chief lobbyist for North Carolina's banking industry. And during this period, which was prior to interstate banking, John played a big part in revisions to state laws that sent North Carolina commercial banks to the forefront of the industry. As a result, when interstate banking was approved later, North Carolina became one of the nation's banking centers. Not surprisingly, during the height of his lobbying career, the General Assembly voted John Jordan the most effective lobbyist of the day. I mentioned that John had a special interest in higher education while in the legislature. He maintained this throughout his life, and a highlight of his interest and influence was his 23 years of service on the UNC Board of Governors, the longest such tenure since that board was established in 1972. And from 1981 to 84, he was chairman of that board. John Jordan's ancestors were among the original colonial settlers of Hertford County, and John was devoted to his hometown community. He established with Brenda the Jordan Foundation to support historical preservation and culture in Hertford County, and endowed a scholarship to Chowan College in Murfreesboro. He and Brenda worked to preserve and restore many important historical buildings, not just there, but also in Raleigh, such as the Leonidas Polk House. John was also a charter member of the North Caroliniana Society and an early president of Wake County Historical Society. As an avid book reader, John had quite an amazing personal library and was truly an erudite man. In fact, it was in this learned capacity that I first knew him. As a child, I remember John as a close friend of my father, William Joslin. They had been undergraduate classmates at Chapel Hill, and of course, were both lawyers and had a great deal in common, both intellectually and in their political passions. But they were also both founding members of a group they called the Study Club, along with 4 other august legal figures in Wake County: Robert McMillan, Joseph B. Cheshire IV, the father of the current practicing attorney, Sam Leaguer, and Charlie Blanchard, and their whip-smart and beautiful wives, Patty Jordan, Mary Joslin, Virginia McMillan, Margie Cheshire, Becky Leaguer, and Bernard Blanchard. Beginning in 1952, this group met once a month in each other's homes and took turns giving papers on any topic of choice. So I remember John Jordan as a kindly and very distinguished man, and frequent visitor in my childhood home on Westlake Drive. This same study club is still alive and well 65 years later. I am humbled and honored to be a current member. I recently found a record of all the papers that were given by the members going back to the group's very first days. John's paper topics are a snapshot into the breadth and liveliness of his intellect, and I'll share a few of those topics with you here. Keep in mind that each one of these is like a research paper, 20 or 30 pages long, like a miniature master's thesis. So that his topics were the two-party system in the South, the Democratic Convention of 1956, Robert Frost, Marco Polo, the Lords Proprietors, the 1848 presidential election, and notorious jury trials of Victorian London. Without exaggeration, this man was a true gentleman and scholar. I well remember John's first wife, Patty, and his children, Nell and Richard, and in later years I have claimed as my friend his second wife, Brenda. Herself an accomplished and amazing artist, and she gave John 34 years of companionship, laughter, and TLC. Now, John, like many very smart people, also tended to be absent-minded at times. Brenda tells the story of her first date with John at the Capital City Club, where they were to be introduced by mutual friends. He arrived a bit late and flustered, straight from the courtroom, and as he rushed in to hang up his overcoat, he locked himself inside the coat closet. So Brenda's first impression of John Jordan was not the smooth, sophisticated lawyer and man of letters, but a man who was pounding on the door of the closet and calling, "Help, please, let me out of here." In another adventure, shortly after they were married, John and Brenda went with a few other members of the UNC Board of Governors on a trip to Great Bear Lake in northern Canada, where it was very cold, even in mid-July. One morning, the group embarked on a fishing expedition on a pontoon boat, and as they were boarding, the guides warned everyone, "Please, mind your steps. Don't fall into the lake." John, however, was too deep in conversation with another fellow, and he could not be bothered to mind his steps. So down he went into the freezing water, where he was plucked out, sopping wet. So instead of fishing, John spent the time with his bare feet stretched out to a quickly kindled campfire, wrapped in a blanket, his dripping clothes hanging on the branches of the surrounding trees. John was the first one to laugh at himself as the biggest fish that anyone pulled out of the water that morning. In fact, John was always able to laugh at himself, I think because he realized that episodes like these show how quickly a person can be reduced to his or her primary human elements, no matter how sophisticated that person might be. All of these things reveal John's humor, his intelligence, his sense of civic responsibility, and his energy. But another important trait came through during his last years. John suffered for a long time from myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune disorder, progressive, that causes muscular weakness, and there's no cure. Throughout this time, John always presented a cheerful face to the world and went out often, always accompanied by the devoted Brenda, and he delighted in seeing his friends. To the end, he was steadfast, hearty, and engaged with this world. He was brave. This was the last and greatest revelation of John's character. Some of you today may be too young to have known John during the heyday of his power and influence, and those days were glorious. But if you knew him in his later years, you knew enough to know what kind of man he was. Character is formed and revealed at the hard edges of life, and John had character. I can sincerely say that our lives today in North Carolina are better because of the energy, vision, courage, and intelligence of John R. Jordan. Thank you, John.
Our next presenter is Keith Kapp. He's a Moorhead and UNC law grad, former president of this bar, and former president of the North Carolina State Bar, to talk about Mark S. Thomas.
May it please the court, I am honored to appear at the request of the family of Mark Stanton Thomas to make remarks in his memory to the court for its official record. Sally, his wife, Liz, his daughter, and other family members are here today. Mark and I joined the Maupin, Taylor, and Ellis firm within a month of each other in 1981. We worked together in that firm and subsequently the Williams Mullen firm with which it merged until Mark's untimely death at age 63 on the 14th of March 2016. I treasure our friendship and my practice of law with Mark Thomas. Mark was born in Leakesville, North Carolina on the 28th of October, 1952, the second son of the late James Kenneth Thomas and Vivian Butler Thomas. He graduated from Grimsley Senior High School in 1971 and Wake Forest University in 1975, where he earned a BA degree in history and politics. At Wake Forest, he was a Guy T. Carswell Scholar, was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, and was active in the Wake Forest University Theater. Mark graduated from Wake Forest University School of Law in 1978, where he was an Irving Carlisle Scholar and an editor of the Law Review. He was always proud of being a double deacon. After law school, he was commissioned as an officer in the United States Army Judge Advocate General Corps. He served 3 years in the JAG Corps, mostly in Bremerhaven in the Federal Republic of Germany. When I think of Mark, I think about what he talked about and thought about most: his faith, his family, his friends, and his firm. Those were the driving forces in his life. Mark was a lifelong Methodist. His upbringing in the Methodist Church had much to do with the person he was. His moral compass was set in the Methodist Church and in the Boy Scout troop sponsored by Market Street United Methodist Church in Greensboro, where he grew up. While he took a 7-year sojourn at an institution in Winston-Salem that had some relation with the Baptist Church for undergraduate studies in law school, it did not in any way detract from his Wesleyan view of the world. He was an active member of Edenton Street Methodist Church, where he served on the administrative board, numerous committees, and as church historian and the director of the church's oral history project. Mark truly walked the walk and talked the talk of a Methodist. Indeed, he hiked in North Carolina on several of the Francis Asbury trails. As I watched Mark take his last breaths, I knew that this was a person of faith who would soon be having canonical dialogue with John Wesley. Very often in talking with Mark, I thought I was reading a John Wesley journal entry. That faith was embedded in a loving family whom he loved. He was an adoring husband. I recall my first meeting of Sally when he invited my wife Chancey and me to come to a concert where she was giving a recital, and I watched her sing a classical love song almost the entire time, looking directly at one beaming Mark Thomas. Mark and Sally met at Raleigh Little Theater working the light board. They were married in 1988. He was a loving and proud dad of Elizabeth Christine Thomas. Liz was definitely the apple of his eye, and he was very proud of everything she did, especially going to Wake Forest University. He steadfastly followed the seventh commandment. He truly honored his father and his mother. He was very solicitous of them. In his last illness, he would not let anyone tell his mother about the seriousness of his condition so that she would not be worried. That was done out of absolute love and honor for the person who reared him. I often heard proud conversations about family times with Brother Jim and Brother Michael and their families. He was very proud of his nieces and nephews. If you were lucky enough to call Mark Thomas a friend, you were indeed a very lucky person. He was the best of friends. Our friendship began when I was clerking in the Supreme Court and considering an offer with the Raleigh law firm of Maupin, Taylor, and Ellis. He was introduced to me by our mutual friend Laura Crumpler from Wake Forest Law, who was clerking with me. Mark and I discussed whether we thought Maupin, Taylor, and Ellis had enough work to keep two of us busy at the same time at the height of the Carter malaise. That began our friendship and a partnership. I literally grew up in the practice of law with Mark, and we continued to practice together throughout our careers. I got to the firm 1 month before Mark because it took him a little longer to complete his military obligations than it took me to complete my clerkship. Our friendship had many similarities beyond just starting at the law firm. We each had a daughter in the same year. We exchanged advice about how to handle eye rolls and exchanged tales of proud events attended where our daughters acted, sang, and performed. Mark was the best of friends. He would do anything for you. His only fault as a friend, in my view, was that he would never ask you for help. He did not want to inconvenience you. If Mark Thomas asked you for help, you knew it was really something that was needed. That friendship at the law firm brings me to the final of my faith, family, and friends and firm comments about Mark, and that is his dedication to the law, the Wake County and North Carolina bars, and in particular to our law firm. When he and I joined Maupin and Taylor and Ellis as the 16th and 17th lawyers, we commiserated for several years about how we would ever get off the bottom of that letterhead. Everything that nobody knew how to do, or everything that anybody did not want to do, was landing on his desk or mine. His mother, in fact, recalled to me that at the hospital as he was dying, that the tombstones, and for those of you that are young and are used to email don't remember, that law firms used to send out announcements by U.S. postal mail about who had joined the law firm, and those were called tombstones. The one that announced my coming to the firm also was the one that announced Mark's coming. When I greeted her after many years at the hospital, she commented that I was the one that was on the same announcement with her son. I have a vivid recollection in our early years of practice of Mark Thomas arguing before Judge James H. Pugh Bailey on a point of law with which Judge Bailey was not in agreement. At that argument, Armistead Maupin was sitting behind Mark and me on the lawyer bench. The argument was not going well, and finally Mr. Maupin reached up and grabbed Mark's coat and set him down. We moved on to the Court of Appeals, and the matter was righted. Mark developed outstanding practices in product liability, in particular asbestos litigation, and in fiduciary litigation, particularly as it relates to ERISA, which is a highly technical branch of the law which deals with employer benefits. He was also proficient in trademark and copyright law. All of these things have one thing in common: federal court. Not all lawyers enjoy federal court, but Mark relished it, its traditions, its rules, its requirements. His track record in the Fourth Circuit is an indication of this. He won 13 appeals and lost 8. However, most of Mark's successes are buried in files in the vaults of our firm, subject to confidentiality orders and settlement agreements with confidential clauses. As a client of Mark, you could be guaranteed that you would get a thorough and scholarly analysis of your situation and a workup of your case that no one could rival. One of his clients commented to me that for Mark it was, quote, detail, detail, detail. At one point he confessed, and to me and also to his brother, quote, I speak in paragraphs. Our senior partner, T. Taylor, referred to him as our own Prosser on torts. His cases were always well prepared, and he was a zealous advocate, but he did it with a gentleman's professional courtesy. If you were on the other side, you could expect to work to prove your case or your defenses, but you could be assured that he would treat you with respect. Mark lent his legal mind to civic and pro bono activities. By way of example, he served on the boards of the City of Raleigh Arts Commission and the North Carolina Master Chorale. He was an excellent member of the bar. He served both as chair of the employment section of the North Carolina Bar Association, and at his death was serving as the chair of the international section of the bar. He was a founder of the local employee benefits law roundtable. He was active on the Wake County Bar History Committee and the Badger Iredell Law Office Foundation. Mark was devoted to his firm and its members. He was always available to pinch hit in trials, as well as covering motions when you were in trial in another case. He assisted many of us with appeals. He was loyal to a fault. If you had something that needed doing, whether it was at the church or the firm or within the bar, Mark was someone you could call on to get it done. We all have benefited by having Mark as someone we knew, whether as our husband, our father, our brother, our fellow Christian, our friend, our lawyer, or our professional colleague. It is unfortunate that more people like Mark Thomas do not walk on this earth. Thank you, Your Honor.
Our next speaker is Martin Brinkley. I know he has a long and distinguished career of excellence and service, but what was listed on his form was currently the Dean of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Law School. So I will introduce him accordingly.
Judge Collins, and may it please the court. It is a great privilege to speak to my Wake County colleagues today, for I still consider you to be that, even though I spend most of my time in Orange County, about one of my heroes, the late Alfred Luther Purrington III. I'm particularly honored to do so in the presence of his wife of more than 50 years, Susie, his brother Ward and sister-in-law Charlotte, his daughter Beth Purrington Alley, and his son John. Al was born in a house on Glenwood Avenue near downtown Raleigh on August 31st, 1933. His father, Alfred Luther Purrington Jr., whom many here will remember with affection, was a 1921 graduate of the University of North Carolina and a native of Halifax County. The elder Mr. Purrington came to Raleigh to practice law nearly a century ago in 1924 after attending the law school at Chapel Hill and passing the bar examination. Once established in the capital, he met, fell in love with, and married Nell Grimes Ward, a vivacious and effervescent Raleigh native, nearly 10 years his junior. In 1940, the Purringtons built a two-story brick house at the corner of the then unpaved Canterbury and Lewis Farm roads. It was in that house that Al, his sister Nella, and brother Ward spent their childhood and youth. The elder Mr. Purrington served as a colonel in the field artillery from 1940 to 1946, while Nella and the younger children followed him around the country to various stateside duty posts. Al, being of school age, stayed with relatives in Raleigh in order to attend Ravenscroft School, then located on Tucker Street. He prepared for college at Woodbury Forest and entered the university at Chapel Hill in 1951, graduating 4 years later with a bachelor's degree in economics. He then served for 3 years in the United States Navy as a line officer on the USS Dias, a radar picket destroyer, and remained in the Naval Reserves until his honorable discharge as a lieutenant commander in 1972. Following his active duty military service, Al entered the Harvard Law School in 1958. At this time, it was the custom for the law school to provide ushers for Christ Church, Cambridge, from among students who identified themselves as Episcopalian. That northern Christ Church is a beautiful, clapboard colonial church on the Cambridge Common, founded in 1759 and saved from destruction in the mid-1770s by George and Martha Washington, who attended it one Christmas while the Continental Army was fighting around Boston. The Washingtons are said to have prayed that the king might be enlightened. While ushering at Christ Church, Cambridge, one Palm Sunday, Al handed a palm to Suzanne Townsend, a doctoral candidate in chemistry at Harvard. A couple of weeks later, Susie and her roommate invited Al to a meatloaf lunch at their apartment after church. Al graduated from law school in 1961 and returned to Raleigh to join his father in practice. 2 years later, he and Susie were married. Other than a 2-year stint as an in-house lawyer in New York City in the late 1960s, Al remained in private practice with his father and later his brother Ward in a firm joined at various times by other outstanding Raleigh lawyers, John Culbertson and William Joslin among them. That firm was known in its later years as Purrington and Purrington. In 1980, the firm merged with the Winston-Salem firm of Womble, Carlisle, Sandridge, and Rice and became the embryo of Womble Carlisle's Raleigh office. After 12 years as a Womble Carlisle partner, Al practiced alone for several years and then joined his son Nick's firm in Greensboro, and Nick has joined us as well today, where he was senior counsel until only a couple of years before his death. His was a general civil and transactional practice with a focus on business and corporate law. He served as one of the first chairs of the business law section of the North Carolina Bar Association in the early 1980s. My principal connection with Al was our shared devotion to the Episcopal Church, and in particular to the parish of Christ Church, Raleigh, and the Diocese of North Carolina. It is that devotion on which I wish to focus the remainder of my remarks, for it is in service to his church that Al made a lasting mark in our profession. As soon as Al came home to practice in 1961, he began 45 years of earnest commitment to what his brother Ward calls the family business. That is, the providing of leadership and legal advice to various constituencies within the Episcopal Church. In this, Al was completely and utterly his father's son and his brother's brother. All three men served multiple terms on the vestry of Christ Church. Their collective vestry service covered more than 7 decades of the 20th century. Al served 5 3-year vestry terms, 3 of them including years as senior warden and 2 of them years as junior warden, a record of vestry service that will probably never be matched. Over the last 40 years, no name recurs in the minutes of the Christ Church vestry so often in such a variety of guises, wearing every church hat there is to wear, as that of Al Purrington. Al was a delegate from Christ Church to 20 conventions of the Diocese of North Carolina, the 4th generation of his father's family to serve in that capacity, as well as a deputy to 3 general conventions of the Episcopal Church. Both he and his father served multiple 3-year terms on the standing committee of our diocese. Both served as chancellor of the diocese, which is the title of the principal legal advisor to the Bishop of North Carolina, for many years. For 12 years in the 1990s and early 2000s, Al served on the board of directors and as president of the Episcopal Home for the Aging, better known as Penick Village in Southern Pines. Nearly all of these forms of diocesan and national church service overlapped with one or more of Al's terms on the Christ Church vestry. It was his gift to move humbly between the most exalted planes of the church hierarchy and the most mundane tasks of the local parish, without ever suggesting or implying that one brand of work was more worthy of his skill than another. As senior warden of Christ Church in 1994, Al presided over extensive repairs to the Christ Church bell tower. Every senior warden has the pleasure of serving as a sounding board for disgruntled members of the congregation at times, but few of these exchanges are memorialized in the vestry minutes. One preserved for posterity was a letter from the late Howard Manning Sr., complaining about the proposed regilding of the famous rooster on the top of the Christ Church tower, by legend the only chicken left in Raleigh following General Sherman's social call in April 1865. Mr. Manning, with his inimitable irascibility, suggested that the parish was giving in to idol worship and ought to be renamed the Church of the Gold-Plated Chicken. I have no doubt that Al took that in stride. Al always supported the church loyally and manfully, even when he had his own questions about the wisdom of one action or another. He respected the institution with all of its imperfections as a thing greater than himself and greater than any communicant, although none had so much earned the right to express an opinion as he. His was the spirit that is not too sure it is right, a spirit that says, I am not infallible, I am not sure I know the answers better than anyone else. As his daughter Beth once told me, my father is a man who is not totally comfortable in his comfort zone. His spirit is that of one who 2,000 years ago taught mankind a lesson it has never learned, but has never quite forgotten, that the exalted shall be humbled, and the humble shall be exalted. There is hardly an aspect of Christ Church or our diocese that did not feel Al Purrington's quiet touch as he moved along, always doing his duty. Where there was work to be done, Al was always there to do it, with a blind and trembling hope that somehow the world would be a little better for his striving. He wore his learning lightly, like the slightly askew bow ties he favored until Parkinson's disease prevented his tying them. He was at once diffident and self-effacing, yet warm and mellow, and at the heart of the man there was always that beating, pulsating, embracing enterprise. By God's grace, he was a vigorous, warm colleague to me, generous in critical and difficult times. He always made every person know that he or she was, just as he or she was, appreciated and respected. Our whole parish watched the miracles he wrought in holding Christ Church together over the years, often without knowing what we were seeing. Al Purrington's work for the church was not just a technical lawyering job. It was ministry in the highest sense of the word. And it is for that ministry and for that wonderful example that I lift up my heart in thanksgiving for this great and good man. Thank you, Your Honor.
On behalf of our committee, and especially my co-chair Brian Oaten, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and I'd like to thank Shawla and Whitney, our videographer, Your Honor, Clerk Knox, bailiffs, for helping us today in holding this special session of court. And most of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming and joining us and sharing your loved ones with us. At this time, I'll hand the ceremony back to Your Honor.
Thank you very much. As always in these ceremonies, we've learned a lot about the history of the Wake County Bar, Wake County, not the least of which is the Church of the Gold-Plated Chicken. I shall never forget that. I want to thank Mr. Chaffee, his committee, for all the valuable service that they provide in putting together this very special program. And may the memories of our departed colleagues, all of whom were truly giants in the law, forever shine brightly in our hearts. Mr. Sheriff, would you please put this special ceremonial session of Wake County Superior Court into adjournment? Sign it out.
Yes, Your Honor. Please stand. Oh, yes, yes. This Honorable Superior Court is now adjourned. Sign it out. God save the state. This Honorable Court. Safe home, everyone.
Thank you very much.